The day the Ghost was born. June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The morning sky was still streaked with the gray of dawn when the USS Enterprise, CV-6, cut through the rolling swells, its deck alive with chaos. The smell of aviation fuel and salt water mixed with the metallic bite of tension. On the flight deck, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the Air Group commander, wiped sweat from his brow as his SBD Dauntless dive bomber roared down the deck. The Battle of Midway had begun. From the Enterprise's island tower, Captain George D. Murray stood motionless, binoculars pressed to his face. He could already hear the distant thumps of anti-aircraft fire. American bombers were finding their targets. Somewhere out there, the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were waiting to finish what Pearl Harbor had started. Below decks, damage control teams ran drills as if the ship had already been hit. The Enterprise's crew knew what had happened to her sister ships. Lexington gone at Coral Sea, Yorktown barely afloat. We're all that's left between them and the Pacific coast, one sailor muttered, tightening a pipe valve with shaking hands. Then came the call over the radio. McCluskey's boys have sighted the enemy. Moments later, the sound reached the carrier. Faint, distant, like thunder on the horizon. The Dauntlesses were screaming down from the sun, releasing their bombs with surgical precision. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were ablaze. The Enterprise's pilots had struck the blow that would change the war. But victory had its price. Not long after the Japanese strike force was mauled, radar operators on the Enterprise detected inbound bogies, enemy dive bombers. The ship's claxons wailed. All hands man your battle stations. Incoming raid, bearing 090. Crewmen dropped whatever they were doing and sprinted to their guns. 5-inch dual-purpose mounts roared to life. 50 caliber Brownings chattered in rhythm. The first wave of Val dive bombers screamed down through clouds of tracer fire. One pilot released his bomb so close that it skipped off the water before detonating near the Enterprise's hull. The shockwave rippled through the ship, knocking men off their feet. When the smoke cleared, the flight deck was scarred but intact. Fires were being beaten down with foam, wounded were carried below, and new aircraft were already being spotted for launch. From the bridge, Captain Murray turned to his executive officer. "Tell Admiral Spruance the Enterprise is still in the fight." As the sun dipped below the horizon, sailors leaned against bulkheads, exhausted and blackened with soot. The Enterprise had taken her first real beating and survived. Over the next 3 years, the crew would come to believe their ship was charmed. The Japanese would give her a name out of grudging respect and superstition: the Gray Ghost. In Tokyo, the radio propagandist Tokyo Rose would soon announce with triumph that the Enterprise had been sunk at Midway. But the next morning, American aircraft launched again from her deck. The Ghost had returned from the dead. The Ghost returns at Santa Cruz, October 26, 1942. The Solomon Islands, South Pacific. The sea was black and angry beneath the USS Enterprise, its hull still showing scars from Midway. Rain lashed across the flight deck, stinging the faces of deck crews struggling to launch aircraft into the teeth of a typhoon. Somewhere beyond the storm, the Japanese Navy was coming, and fast. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands had begun. Inside the Combat Information Center, Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid stood over the radar display. The faint green blips were closing in. He turned to his staff. "Gentlemen, the Japs are throwing everything they have left at us. We'll hold the line." Enterprise's Air Group, VB-10, VF-10, and VT-10, launched into the storm, wings shuddering, as they vanished into gray sheets of rain. They were outnumbered 2-1, facing the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. Above the clouds, the enemy's elite pilots, the same men who had triumphed at Pearl Harbor, formed up in deadly precision. By mid-morning, Enterprise was under direct assault. Val dive bombers burst from the clouds like hawks, screaming downward with bomb bay doors open. The ship's 5-inch .38 caliber guns fired in controlled fury, bursts of black flak filling the air. The first bomb hit near the aft elevator. The blast threw men off their feet and ripped open the flight deck. Below, in Damage Control Central, Chief Boatswain's Mate Thomas O'Hara barked orders through the smoke. "Seal the bulkhead. Get those pumps running." Fires raged through compartments as sailors, some barely out of high school, fought to keep their ship afloat. The Enterprise shuddered again as a second bomb slammed amidships. The lights flickered, then died. The engine room filled with smoke and the smell of burning oil. For 2 hours, she burned. And yet, through the chaos, the Ghost refused to die. Her crew patched flight decks with steel plates, cleared wreckage, and, impossibly, launched more aircraft. From the bridge, Captain Kincaid could see his pilots diving through enemy flak, striking back at the Shokaku. The Japanese carrier erupted in flame. Tokyo Rose's voice would later echo across shortwave radios. "The USS Enterprise is no more. The proud American carrier has gone to the bottom." But she hadn't. The Enterprise, listing and smoking, limped away under her own power, her flight deck so torn that aircraft had to land one at a time, threading between holes scorched through steel. When she finally reached Noumea for repairs, sailors from other ships lined the harbor walls and saluted. They had heard the same rumor, that she was gone, and could hardly believe their eyes. The Ghost had returned again. On her battered hull, someone painted in white letters, "Enterprise vs. Japan. Enterprise leads 2-0. But the war was far from over. The Japanese Navy was regrouping, and their vengeance would come in the form of new weapons. Weapons no one could have imagined. Fire over the Marianas. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The horizon shimmered with heat as the USS Enterprise steamed west with Task Force 58, the mightiest naval armada ever assembled. Hundreds of aircraft crowded her flight deck, Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntlesses, their wings folded like a forest of steel. Sailors called it the Great Turkey Shoot, but no one was laughing yet. Below decks, the air was thick with oil, sweat, and anticipation. Lieutenant J.G. Edward Butch O'Hare's replacement, a young fighter pilot named Ensign George Brown, sat in the ready room, staring at the photo of his wife taped to his kneeboard. "They say this'll break their back," he whispered to no one. Outside, the ship's loudspeaker crackled to life. "All air groups, prepare for launch. Enemy carriers sighted at 200 miles. Engines screamed to life. One by one, Grumman F-6F Hellcats thundered down the deck, lifting into the morning sky. The Enterprise's air group joined a swirling mass of silver aircraft that stretched to the horizon. Over 900 American planes. High above the fleet, radar operators on the Enterprise watched the screen light up with incoming bogies. The Japanese were sending everything, Zeros, Judys, and Kates, wave after wave. Captain Matt Sherman, the ship's commanding officer, turned to his gunnery officer. "We'll take them all, mister, every last one." At 10:45 a.m., the first Japanese formation appeared over the fleet. The Enterprise's anti-aircraft guns opened up, a wall of steel and fire. The meatball insignia of enemy planes flashed through smoke as tracers tore the sky apart. One Judy bomber broke through the barrage, dove straight toward the carrier, and released its bomb. It slammed just off the starboard bow, blowing a hole big enough to flood the forward compartments. Fire teams moved instantly. Hoses hissed, bulkheads sealed, and wounded men were carried below. Above, pilots returning from the air battle circled like guardian hawks. By evening, the sky was filled with the wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Over 300 Japanese planes were destroyed, most without ever reaching their targets. The Enterprise's flight deck was blackened, her anti-aircraft gunners deafened and trembling, but she still floated. When the sun set, the sea was littered with burning debris. In the wardroom, Captain Sherman finally allowed himself a breath. "They'll say we were lucky," he murmured. But luck doesn't patch decks or fight fires. Men do. The Enterprise sailed on, battered but unbeaten. Yet the Japanese were not finished. As their carrier fleet lay shattered, their pilots were already preparing a new weapon, one born of desperation and fanaticism. The kamikazes were coming. October 25th, 1944. Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The morning sky burned orange with rising smoke. From the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, sailors watched columns of fire on the horizon, ships of Task Force 38 under kamikaze attack. The air stank of gasoline and death. Over the loudspeakers came the calm, clipped voice of the air officer. "Enemy suicide planes inbound. All hands to battle stations." Every man aboard the Enterprise knew this day would come. The Japanese had begun deploying their last weapon, kamikaze pilots, men willing to die by ramming their aircraft into Allied ships. They called it Tokotai, special attack units. The Americans called it madness. The first wave appeared out of the clouds. A6M Zeros, their wings painted with the red sun of Japan, diving at impossible speeds. On the bridge, Captain Matt Sherman gripped the rail as tracers arced upward from the carrier's 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. The sky turned into a storm of metal. One kamikaze came straight for the Enterprise. Its engine howled like a banshee. "He's not pulling up," shouted a gunner. The Zero slammed into the flight deck just aft of the island. The explosion ripped open steel, sending shrapnel and burning aviation fuel across the deck. Dozens of men were hurled to the ground. Flames climbed stories high. Below decks, the blast threw sailors off ladders and burst open fuel lines. Chief Damage Control Officer Donald "Doc" Bierman led his team through smoke-filled corridors, coughing black soot. "Keep it contained. Starboard side only," he barked. Above, flight crews dragged the wounded from the inferno, while others, burned and bleeding, helped reload the anti-aircraft guns. One gunner, missing half his hearing, yelled over the roar, "We're still firing, damn it! Keep firing!" By noon, the flight deck was a scene from hell. Fires raged, planes burned, and yet the Enterprise's flag still flew. Another kamikaze screamed in from the south, chased by a Hellcat. The Japanese pilot's wing clipped the radar mast, and his plane cartwheeled into the sea, exploding just yards from the hull. The ship shook, but didn't falter. When the smoke finally cleared, over 60 men were dead or wounded. And yet, within hours, repair crews had patched the deck enough to launch aircraft again. At dusk, a squadron of Avengers lifted off to strike back at the retreating Japanese fleet. The Ghost still fought. That night, exhausted men gathered in the mess hall, their faces lit by dim red lamps. Someone passed around a scrap of metal torn from the kamikaze's fuselage. Etched in Japanese characters were the words, "To die for the Emperor." A young sailor turned it over, shaking his head. "They can die for him," he said quietly. "We'll live for ours." The USS Enterprise had taken a direct kamikaze hit and refused to sink. Tokyo Rose announced again, her voice triumphant over Japanese radio. "The Enterprise is gone. The gray ghost rests at the bottom of the Philippine Sea." But the next week, she was seen again. Her flight deck patched, her planes roaring skyward. The ghost had risen once more, May 14th, 1945. Off Okinawa, Pacific Theater. Dawn broke red over the horizon, not the soft crimson of sunrise, but the glow of war. The USS Enterprise rode the swells just east of Okinawa, her once sleek hull now patched like an old prizefighter. Scars from bombs, torpedoes, and kamikaze hits traced her sides like battle tattoos. She had been declared sunk 3 times, and each time she had come back. But now, in the final act of the Pacific War, Japan was throwing everything it had left. On the bridge, Captain Stuart D. Ingersoll, Enterprise's last wartime commander, studied the radar display. The operator's voice trembled. "Multiple bogies inbound, sir. Bearing 270. Fast." He knew what that meant. Another Kikusui wave, the Japanese massed suicide raids that had turned Okinawa into a slaughterhouse. "Sound general quarters," Ingersoll ordered. "All guns to ready." Klaxons screamed across the ship. Gunners sprinted to their stations, loading belts of ammunition as the sky filled with the deep thump of the carrier's 5-inch batteries. From the east came the first Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, sunlight glinting off its canopy as it dropped from the clouds. Tracer fire met it mid-dive, hundreds of rounds slamming into its fuselage, but the pilot held course. He was burning, but still diving. The aircraft smashed into the Enterprise's flight deck, just forward of the island tower. The explosion tore through parked planes, hurled men into the air, and set the deck ablaze. The gray ghost was on fire again. The blast punched straight through to the hangar deck, where aviation fuel ignited in a chain reaction. Flames roared through the compartments, licking the very bones of the ship. Fire crews charged into the inferno, hoses hissing, their faces wrapped in rags, soaked with seawater. They fought not just the fire, but the fear that this time the ghost's luck had finally run out. For hours they battled the blaze. Ammunition cooked off like popcorn in the heat. Sections of the deck collapsed underfoot. Above, gunners kept firing at incoming aircraft, even as the smoke thickened. One sailor, his uniform blackened with soot, muttered as he reloaded, "You can't kill what's already dead." By late afternoon, the fires were under control, but Enterprise was crippled. Her flight deck was shattered, the forward elevator blown clean out of its shaft. The ship limped away under her own power, still afloat, barely. She had suffered her last combat wound. As the ship pulled out of Okinawa, crewmen stood at the railings, watching the island fade into haze. They'd heard Tokyo Rose again that morning, her voice mocking, almost cheerful. "The Enterprise has finally sunk beneath the waves. The gray ghost is gone forever." But the sailors of CV-6 just laughed, because they were still standing on her decks. A week later, in Ulithi Lagoon, a signalman painted new white letters along the island superstructure. Enterprise versus Japan. Enterprise leads 20-0. In June 1945, the Ghost returned to Pearl Harbor for the last time. Her decks were twisted, her paint scorched, and her crew, those who survived, worn thin by 3 relentless years of war. But she had done the impossible. From Midway to Okinawa, she had fought in nearly every major battle of the Pacific, earning 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. warship in World War II. When word reached Tokyo that the Enterprise had survived yet again, one Japanese admiral reportedly said, "If the Americans have ships like that, then perhaps the gods have chosen their side." Months later, when Japan finally surrendered, sailors aboard the battered carrier gathered on deck. The Pacific was silent for the first time in years. The sun dipped behind the horizon, its reflection glinting off the ship's warped steel. The gray ghost, scarred, immortal, and undefeated, drifted in the twilight, a survivor of every storm. The USS Enterprise refused to die.